So the inputs this week are to open up the issues around leading and managing in the human rights context, looking at what constitutes good leadership and management, and what those terms broadly mean, and linking to the word effective, as in a module title, Leading and Managing Effective Human Rights Organisations. I'll open up the role of organisations and of organising for the better promotion and protection of human rights, and that's organising in informal as well as formal ways, and looking at the range of organisational forms chosen by human rights defenders, not just the traditional NGO formula. And I'll open up, as well some of you will be well aware in your own personal circumstances, the importance of efficient and effective management and organisation in the face of government and non-state actor attacks. So to give a very small example, if we are appropriately transparent in our fundraising and in how we spend the organisation's resources, we may be better able to stand against or contradict allegations of money laundering, or that we are a front for Western interests, for example. So the material this week connects to the underpinning questions within the module as a whole. How can we, through more effective human rights organisations, increase the security of human rights defenders at the organisational level? And what is it that we can strengthen in our organisations in order to be more resilient and more sustainable in the face of uncertainty and change? I want to start by opening up that word organisations. And in our lives, we have organisations around us all the time, those that we engage with on a personal or professional basis, or which otherwise shape the culture or society in which we live, the economic reality within which people live. Some of them are not-for-profit, such as the University of York, although there is a strong profitization trend within the academic third sector world to be good businesses as well as to do good. Some of these companies or organisations have better or worse reputations. Certainly in my own country, G4S, I have great concerns about the securitization of public spaces through private companies. Here's another organisation, was new a few years ago, has a structure and purpose and identity, and nevertheless bringing profound concerns about its operation and its purpose. Human rights organisations, Amnesty International as a well-known international brand, through to local or national organisations doing great work out of the public headlines or out of the public general awareness. We have organisations such as the United Nations, collaboration of states, for better or worse, for increased security and protection of human rights, with all its failings and its complications and inertia, simply by being an enormous organisation. This is the logo of the Brazilian football team, another organisation structured around performance and entertainment, and yet with a hierarchy of people and a variety of roles, from the entertainers on the pitch through to their coaches and managers, through to the commercial arms, and maybe their corporate social responsibility teams as well as their finance and IT and human resources, all of these contained within an organisation. And for some of us, we see our family as an organisation of people with different amounts of power, different amounts of influence, people with varying interests and skills and motives, all trying in some way perhaps to be a family, and nevertheless linked by relationships and history. Another form of organisation that we can use in order to understand how humans collaborate. So if we think of our families, we can ask questions such as who does have the power? How are decisions made? What are the rules in the family? And how invisible are they? How much are they negotiated? So, opening up the idea of organisations all around that influence and affect who we are and how we engage with the world. And for some of these, the means of engaging with the world in parts of our lives. So daily power of organisations, we feel their force. Most of what we achieve or do is through organisations of one form or another. And all of those organisations on the previous slide began with an idea. Someone or some few having an idea, let's create something, a gap in the market or a new need in the world or a new opportunity to be exploited. And I'm not just meaning commercially. And I hope you might think it's true that most human rights defenders, whether they are leaders or managers, staff, frontline, administrative or technical support, that broadest definition of people who work in human rights sector will end up in an organisation at some point, either creating or leading it, or managing it, or working in one, or working with one as an outsider. And, of course, the organisations that repress or limit civil society space, another form of organisation that we engage with and that human rights organisations engage with. So I'm giving you some kind of sense of the importance of understanding organisations per se in themselves as we move into understanding how to improve leadership and management within effective human rights organisations. So we may know from our personal experience the impact of poor leadership and management. The organisation may set objectives that are impossible to attain or irrelevant, meaningless in the context. Worthy objectives perhaps, but which bear no value to communities or stakeholders with whom the organisation works. The organisation may be weak because it depends on one person, perhaps typically the founder, who has perhaps stayed too long or who cannot manage a transfer of power to others. And if that leader goes, what then for the future of the organisation? The organisation may not be able to prove that it is doing any good in the world. It may be doing great work, but there is no monitoring and evaluation and impact assessment. It may not be able to honestly or properly account for how money comes in and from where, and on what it is spent. And that leaves the organisation vulnerable to criticism or challenge around its financial transparency and honesty. An organisation may be dependent just on one source of funding, and if the organisation is unsuccessful in its next funding bid, or the funder changes its priorities, or simply there is too much competition and the funder chooses not to fund you next time, if you are reliant only on one source, you are at risk for your long-term sustainability. Poor people management, you may have experienced this through your working life, and thus will have experience of how that can be very demotivating, encourage you to leave, and the organisation then wastes all its investment in you as you take your skills and expertise and knowledge to a new organisation. The organisation may be unable to cope with change and be unable to react quickly to new circumstances. So those are some of the everyday drivers for needing more effective leadership and management within organisations. In the human rights sector, there are others. The criticisms that that human rights NGOs undergo about inappropriate or wastage of money, for example, or alliance with governments, or inability to bring about effective change. We know that regimes are increasing their attacks on human rights organisations in some countries, restricting the flow of money in, the ability to spend money that has been raised, and imposing registration or other legislative performance requirements on the organisations. And there's a reference there to the in-house journal of the Centre for Applied Human Rights, which looks particularly at these issues. And through the library, which you now have access to through this course, you can access the articles in that journal. Northern NGOs spending money for the benefit of the South, a long-term critique, and there's an example in the reading of that kind of analysis of where organisations need to be able to hold themselves accountable. And there is a general call, a good call, I think, for organisations to be more transparent and to be more effective at demonstrating the value that they're bringing to the world. I think there is a general raising of expectations that just because you have money does not mean you have an automatic mandate. And we see more and more partnerships between northern and southern organisations. What does that imply for both organisations in terms of choice of strategic objectives, decisions as to how funding is allocated, and what is measured? Who decides what is measured and how? I've been using that phrase, human rights organisations, and here are some definitions. A private association which devotes significant resources to the promotion and protection of human rights. There's a straightforward definition. And association could mean an organisation formally or informal networks, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But basically the primary purpose of the organisation is about human rights. And for most human rights organisations, genuine ones, not front organisations, they are independent, and that they are interested, they may focus on one's area of rights or one particular community, but they are for rights generally, and that how they operate should be a demonstration of rights in practice. So human rights organisations are means to an end, and in themselves a demonstration of to what extent human rights are protected and recognised and valued by community and society as a whole. What I want to mention at this stage is something called unruly politics, which is about non-traditional or non-organisational forms of organising for human rights and for social change, addressing questions or exploring new ways of how power, politics and citizenship are being addressed within social movements. And there's a reading this week which looks at some of the themes. I'll give you the reading in a moment, which looks at phenomena such as the Arab Spring or the occupying movement, and talks about how these can be seen as unruly or different, i.e. they are not done within the traditional rules of NGO action. So there's a mention of the in Egypt, early on in the Arab Spring, people participating not from some particular identity, say Egyptian perhaps, and neither was their demand that Mubarak leave a simple articulation of individual interest. There was a collective call, and it makes it difficult perhaps for the state to engage. In a sense, Mubarak had to engage with everyone in Tahrir Square, because they were coming as themselves and collectively, rather than representing any particular interest. And similarly with the Occupying movement, an early demand was, well, what are your demands of the Occupying movement? And that's not what people were for. They were standing in opposition to globalisation and the structural oppression that comes through some forms of capitalism. So there is a different reason or purpose or representation other than a traditional representation of interests or a community or a view or an idea that if you turn up you are thereby representing someone else. There is the idea of this form of unruly politics happening in the streets, in public spaces, not in offices out of view or in government departments, the kind of traditional taking on or engagement with the state. So there was a reading there, and in the postgraduate certificate folder, an additional reading around looking at Argentina by Marina Citrin, and some very interesting ideas around collaboration and self-management and sharing of political power, so that decision-making is a process, an ongoing process of discovery and collaboration, rather than a fixed hierarchy, and that autogestion is not the what do we do, but how do we organise. And again, that reference to public space, and that I turn up as myself and I build relationships on power and trust. So I'm going to pause there, and we'll carry on in a separate segment.